So, what good is Porter's five-force framework anyway? What can you actually use it for? What's its practical value? Porter's five-force framework is intended to help you assess the current and, more importantly, the future profitability of industries, of market segments within an industry, and of positions on the value chain of an entire complex of vertically linked industries. So, for example, you might use the five-force framework to assess the profit potential of particular regional markets, or the potential profitability of particular products that your company might be considering producing, or the potential profitability of particular types of customers that your company is considering serving, or the potential profitability of a particular distribution channel that your company is considering using. The five-force framework can be especially helpful in identifying underserved markets, markets whose needs are currently not being served well, perhaps because they're in remote locations or for whatever reason. Now, once you've done this sort of assessment and gathered this information and analysis, what would you do with it? Well, obviously, the point is that you would want to enter those markets or market segments that you expect will become more profitable, while exiting those markets or market segments that you expect will become less profitable over time in the future. Now, you can also use the five-force framework to forecast future prices, costs, and profits when considering a market entry or exit. It will give you a pretty exhaustive checklist of the factors that are likely to determine prices, costs, and profits in the future of an industry or market. And this is particularly useful when you're considering markets or industries that do not yet exist. If an industry already exists and you want to know the average profitability of the industry, it's quite a simple matter. You just go and take a look at the profitability of the companies that are in the industry, and you calculate an average, and you know what the average profitability is. It's that simple. But where the five-force framework is particularly useful is in situations where you can't do that because the industry or the market does not yet exist. So think, for example, of high-tech industries where we're talking about a product or service that is just now being innovated and has never been sold before. So when you try to assess the future potential profitability of the industry or market for that new product, how do you know? How do you know how profitable it's going to be? The only tool you have to rely on in such a situation is the five-force framework. And so that's why it's particularly useful in situations where the industry or market is just coming into existence and does not yet exist. Another way that the five-force framework can be used is as a lens for interpreting the news. You're hit as a manager, you're constantly hit with a barrage, a constant stream of news items about your industry from the trade press and trade magazines in your industry. And it can be difficult to know whether this news is good news or bad news sometimes. And the five-force framework helps you get an answer to that question. It helps you give you a framework, a lens for interpreting how will the events that are reported in this news affect the overall profitability of the industry? How will it affect the companies in my industry? Because you can go through like a checklist all five of the forces to see how does this news affect the rivalry in the industry? How does it affect the threat of new entrants? How does it affect the bargaining power of buyers or suppliers? And so on. So it can be particularly useful as an interpretive lens. The five-force framework can also be used to help your company rationalize its positioning and select a better competitive positioning. Find ways to mitigate the greatest threat among the five forces. It can be used to anticipate and prepare for industry evolution, for changes in the five forces as they will occur in future years. If as they say, forewarned is forearmed. If by doing a five-force analysis, you notice that some of the forces are changing and are likely to continue to change in the future, or perhaps accelerate in their change, then you can anticipate and prepare for those changes. And it helps you to position your company better for the future. You can also use the five-force framework to try to implement an industry transformation. What does that mean? That means you're looking for ways to change the five forces to your advantage. We usually think about these five competitive forces, since they are external in nature, as being things that are beyond the company's control, but that's not always the case. There have been situations, they are rare, I will admit, but there have been situations where companies have been able to find ways to change the five forces to their advantage. Let's talk about some of those ways that can happen and can create a total industry transformation. You can differentiate what is otherwise a commodity product. It's almost inconceivable to think of a product that can't be differentiated somehow. I mean, even if we're talking about a commodity chemical, there are ways that companies can differentiate that product through on-time delivery guarantees, or through additional service or additional consulting services that are sold along with the chemicals. So there are ways to differentiate even a commodity product, if you are clever enough about finding them. And that can be a way to transform the industry to your advantage, because if you're the only one who has this way to differentiate this commodity product, then you benefit. Another way that you can try to transform an industry is to create a mass market version of what is ordinarily thought of as a high-end product. A great example here would be Apple Computer. Apple's great vision in the early days of the company was to take what was, at the time, a very esoteric, very expensive, very complicated product and simplify it dramatically so that it could be accessible to the masses. Apple's vision of putting a computer in every home and on every desktop was very radical for its day. Nobody thought that that was possible or desirable. And Apple found a way to do it by just dramatically simplifying the product and making it more accessible to the ordinary person. Innovating to create switching costs is another way that you can transform an industry. And here a great example is what Becton Dickinson did in the blood collection industry. Time was, decades and decades ago, when doctors wanted to collect blood samples from patients. They used syringes. Basically, they drew blood, and if they had to draw multiple samples of blood, they had to stick the patient multiple times with multiple syringes. Well, patients didn't like that too much. They didn't like getting stuck several times in a row. Plus, it wasn't particularly good medically, because the more times you stick a person, the greater the chances of infection. And, of course, it increases the chances of something going wrong. And so what Becton Dickinson did was they invented a system that basically obsoleted the syringe as a blood collection device. They created something they call the vacutainer system. And what the vacutainer system is it's an interlocking system of needles and tubes and containers so that you can stick the patient just once and collect multiple samples of blood so that you can do multiple tests on the blood. You basically stick the patient once and then attach and unattach various collection vessels to the needle. And so you can collect a whole bunch of different samples of blood with only one needle stick. This has been great in terms of, improving quality of care, and also in terms of helping Becton Dickinson, because Becton Dickinson went to something like 60 or 70%, some dramatically huge, I don't know what the exact figures are, but some substantially huge market share in the blood collection device market. Why was that? Well, because they had created switching costs. With the old system, with using syringes to collect blood, you as a doctor had no switching costs, or as a hospital or clinic. You could buy syringes from company A on Tuesday and then switch to buying syringes from company B on Wednesday and go to company C on Thursday. There was no switching cost. There was no reason why you had to stick with any one company. But the Becton Dickinson vacutainer system was an interlocking system. The vessels and the needles and the tubes, they all work together and fit together as a system. So once you got started with using the Becton Dickinson vacutainer system, you were stuck with buying supplies only from Becton Dickinson, because they were the only people producing the product that would fit together, interlocking seamlessly. And so they created switching costs. They made it more difficult for hospitals and clinics and doctors once they had decided to use the Vacutainer system to switch to anything else. Another way to transform an industry is to try to find new economies of scale and scope. And a great example here would be Blockbuster Video. Blockbuster Video took what was at the time a very fragmented mom-and-pop business. There were literally thousands and thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, of small little video rental shops. It was a mom-and-pop business. And what Blockbuster did was they created economies of scale in a couple of different areas. First, in marketing. They had huge marketing muscle and could enable customers in any part of the country to rent videos in any other part of the country, something they couldn't do if they were just subscribing to their local mom and pop video store. Secondly, they created economies of scale in purchasing because that gave them greater bargaining power against the suppliers of the videotapes, the movie studios. And also, they developed a unique computer system to help them figure out and forecast how many copies of each new video they needed to buy, and also how many weeks they should hold it on the shelves before they started selling the rental videos as used videos. Because if they wait too long to take those rental videos out of rental circulation and start selling them, then they won't be able to sell them. Of course, if they move too quickly to move the rental videos onto the sale shelf, then they lose a lot of rental revenue. So there's a very fine line there in terms of the timing of when you start moving rental videos from rental circulation into putting them on the shelf for sale as used videos. And by getting that right, by being able to forecast exactly how many copies of the video they should buy and when they should start getting rid of them, they were able to develop huge economies of scale. And that really helped them to dominate the video rental industry. Another way to affect an industry transformation is to try to consolidate a fragmented industry. Of course, Blockbuster did that, but another example of a company that did that would be Standard Oil under John Rockefeller. Rockefeller's great insight was to recognize that there were huge economies of scale at the refining stage of the value chain. In the production of petroleum, or at the time kerosene, which was the main product at the time, it wasn't gasoline, it was kerosene because the initial main use of the product was for lighting, not for transportation. Rockefeller figured out that, look, there are no economies of scale in exploration and in production of the oil, pulling it out of the ground, and there are no real economies of scale in distribution or retailing, but there were tremendous economies of scale in the refining stage. And so what Rockefeller did was he bought up all the refiners until he had a 90-something% market share of the kerosene industry in the United States. And once he had consolidated the industry at the refining stage, he exerted tremendous power both upstream and downstream in the value chain, which enabled him to dominate those stages of the value chain as well. He was able to backward integrate into production and exploration, and then forward integrate into distribution and retailing, and totally dominate the kerosene industry. So that's another example of consolidating a fragmented industry. Finally, you can try to transform an industry by creating or exploring novel distribution channels. And a good example there might be Amazon or eBay. Amazon taking the whole concept of retailing to the internet, or eBay, which basically used the web to put the whole concept of a classified ad on steroids. Basically, eBay is taking a big chunk out of the classified advertising business away from the newspapers because their product is a superior way to buy and sell things, because it exposes the product to a much wider market and gets better prices for the people who are selling products.